So today is August 1st, so that marks week 4 of the CPTC boot camps. Um, and then once again, sign in, please, if you haven't already. Um, I can do another introduction of myself if you weren't here for week 2. But I'm Anthony. I'm a master's student in the information security program. Currently interning at SoFi as a SOC analyst. And some of my previous competition, like history, I was threat hunter for CCDC last year, and then I was on the Windows side for CPTC last year as well. This year, I'll also be threat hunter for CCDC, and I'll be co-captaining with Ryan Miller for CPTC this year. Here's kind of just an overview of the schedule, and we are August 1st, so we are week 4. This is roughly halfway done with the boot camps. And we'll have tryouts in a few weeks. So for the agenda today, for Linux, hacking Linux, we'll be going over some of the common services you'll see when doing like engagements on Linux. Someone in the chat asked for the sign-in sheet. And then some of the tools that you can leverage to either do enumeration or like look for privilege escalation vectors or things just to help you kind of like on the homework and on the tryouts. And if you are still learning to do future engagements for yourself, and then some attacks, and then we'll finally go over the lab and the homework for the week. So some of the common Linux services that you'll see, a big one is FTP, which runs on port 21. FTP can be very vulnerable if misconfigured. I know there's a lot of FTP exploits, especially if it's like really outdated. SSH is also a big one. SSH is pretty much used to kind of manage servers. It's kind of a shell, a secure shell that you get to kind of connect to hosts remotely, and it's used for a lot of administrative tasks, but can also be leveraged maliciously. Um, then we have HTTP and HTTPS. This is most commonly a website, and this you'll see this a lot on Linux boxes, and a lot of times it'll actually be your initial access to the backend server that's running Linux. And then we have your databases, and this can be anything from like MySQL, MariaDB, or like Postgres, whatever the database may be, Mongo. But yeah, so moving on to FTP, like I said, it runs on TCP port 21. And this can be leveraged to kind of host files for downloading um, and uploading as well. And a big thing with FTP, if you can get anonymous access, I wouldn't rely on that too much as it's kind of like the most common misconfiguration and it's like a known thing to not configure. So I wouldn't rely on getting that too many times, but if it's there, it's really valuable and can help make your life a lot easier. Um, Sometimes it'll be anonymous, and a lot of times it will require credentials to use the service. And then when you're working with FTP, you really want to look through for like sensitive content and like credentials that you can use to either move laterally or log into a higher privileged user, or this may be your initial access vector if you can get credentials that are just on the FTP for a user on the Linux server. And then VSFTP 2.3.4 is a very common exploit with FTP. It's for a pretty old version, but you can leverage that as well if it's present in the environment that you're doing an engagement on. Moving on to SSH, like I mentioned before, this is basically a secure shell you can use to remotely access and manage and administer systems. This would be commonly used if in like an enterprise environment, like this is you SSH into something and then you do whatever you need to do. Can also be leveraged to transfer files with SCP. I'm not sure on the command syntax for SCP, but it's fairly simple to just um, transfer files over. If you want to get, like say you're using some specific tool for privilege escalation, and you have SSH access, you can just SCP something over from your host machine or yeah. A lot of times it will require credentials or a authorized key pair. So these ones in the bottom, these two down here are kind of two types of SSH keys. We have the RSA and then the Edwards key. I think the more used one now is the ED25519. I think it's just faster, but I mean both of them will work. They have different use cases, I guess. And then yeah, private key could be acquired through file read. So if you get file read um, for say an account on Linux, um, you can try to read to see if the user has any SSH files that you can use or SSH keys in their respective directories, and then try to get initial access that way. And then moving on to HTTP and HTTPS. Like I mentioned before, a lot of times you'll find this like a website being your initial access to the backend Linux server. Um, and this kind of helps with like putting everything together, like learning what you learned from last week's web week, and trying to get like that RCE so you can kind of build like a reverse shell or something like that. And you also want to look through like NPI, API endpoints um, and on like different ports that there might be another website running on or things of that nature. And then looking through the source code of these might help you get some clues on how you can get initial access. Or sometimes there might be even like hard-coded credentials within the source code that you can leverage to get your access on the Linux server. And moving on to databases. Databases are basically just things that store a lot of data in these database structures. Um, and a lot of times you'll find them um, storing things like credentials and passwords that could be hashed, but can be decrypted very easily. Um, yeah, a lot of times if you're doing an engagement, you might find PII or things like passwords, like I mentioned. Um, but yeah, if you get access to a database, that could be huge. And moving on to tools. Um, we mentioned this in week two, I believe. But MSF Venom for payload generation, building like reverse shells, ways to get initial access if they work with like the Metasploit framework. And then we linked a MSF Venom cheat sheet so you can kind of go and look at through that and see if you run into a scenario. Um, in an engagement that you're doing that this could be useful or it's vulnerable to, and you can use this specific reverse shell or yeah. Next I have revshells.com. So like I mentioned, web is a big thing that you are likely going to get initial access on for a lot of engagements that you're doing to get onto the actual Linux server. This is just a handy public website that you can use to generate reverse shells if you get command injection or like RCE on that website. And then file transfer. This is kind of for transferring files um, either from your attacker machine to the, sorry, from your attacker machine to the uh, Linux host that you compromised and got access on. So let's say you're trying to For the sake of this, I'll go to the next slide, linpeas. So say you're trying to get linpeas on whatever Linux host that you just compromised. Um, but there's no like outbound internet access on that machine. Um, or you can't get it directly from like this GitHub link, but you can reach it from your attacker machine. Um, you can host the linpeas executable on a Python web server. And then from the other machine, you can use like a wget or a curl if that's available and kind of transfer it that way. But yeah, and then moving on to linpeas. So once you get initial access, um, this is a great thing. I always use this when I get initial access on a Linux box. It kind of just is a very large script that'll output a lot of things that are that could be vulnerable, and then it'll kind of highlight them. I think the orange and red one is like 95% possible privilege escalation vector, and there's like other highlights. It highlights it into like tiers, and it kind of makes your life a little bit easier. It doesn't always find exactly what you need, but a lot of times it can find that like low-hanging fruit. And yeah, I would definitely recommend using this if you get initial access on a Linux box. It'll kind of help you kind of map out the kind of privilege escalation vectors that you might want to take. Um, but yeah, it basically does a lot of the enumeration for you. Moving on to the GTFO bins. This is kind of like um, I want to say it's like a not like a database, but like kind of like what was it? Like exploit DB, but for specifically like exploiting Linux binaries. A lot of times, if you get like a set UID bit set on a specific binary, GTFO bins will have a way documented on how you can exploit that and escalate your privileges and possibly even get root. Um, I'll try to bring up an example after, but yeah, I'll come back to this one. And then Google, another reminder just to always use Google, especially with like the versioning thing. Like if FTP is vulnerable to 2.3.4 or another exploit or any of these services um, are vulnerable, definitely look up. That could make your life a lot easier during your engagement. And moving on to attacks for Linux, we have SUID and SGID. I'll go back over that. It kind of has to do with the GTFO bins. We have environment variables, weak file permissions, vulnerable applications, kernel exploits, pseudo abuse, and cron jobs. Here's an example of insecure file permissions. So weak file permissions on sensitive files, things like Etsy password, Etsy shadow, can help you um, if you find that these are present, like insecure, especially Etsy shadow. You can possibly um, write into this file a new user, and then that's your kind of initial access. If you um, if or maybe like your privilege escalation vector. But yeah, if you find that these files, it's with Etsy Shadow either readable or, but if either of these are writable, then that can help you tremendously. Then we have SUID bits. Here's kind of a better understanding. And then again, I'll go back over with the GTFO bins. But executables with SUID bit kind of run as the owner of that. So if you find like a certain binary has that SUID bit set, um, a lot of times you can, for example, if you find that like the bash binary on Linux is run with or has that SUID binary, you can execute a bash shell and then it will. if you use like TACP, which will persist the the privileges of like the owner of that, which is root, it can spawn you a root shell. And I'll kind of go over that to have like a better visualization. And then, oh, here's the exact thing I was talking about. But yeah, so this kind of finds like um, binaries with the SOID bit set. This like find command right here. And as we can see, bash has it in this specific scenario. And then here's the this is GTFO bins. So if you run the bin slash bash, the actual binary with tacp, it'll actually spawn you a root shell. So definitely look for things like that if you're doing an engagement. Moving on to sudo abuse. So you definitely want to see if you have sudo access to anything. Like in this case, they're using base64. And then to do that, you can use sudo tac-l, and this will list the sudo privileges that that your current user has. As you can see in this example, we're trying to read Etsy shadow, and we get a permission denied. But we can see that after doing sudo tac-l, we have sudo privileges to the base64 binary. So here we're creating a variable that sets file as Etsy shadow. And then if you run that base64 binary, um, here we're basically encrypting it and then decrypting it. And then we get the output of Etsy shadow. That's kind of a way you can leverage um, things that are configured for you with like sudo, like having that sudo access to some specific binary, and then figuring out a way how you can leverage that to kind of do things you're not supposed to. And then moving on to cron tabs. So cron tabs and cron jobs are kind of like th ways to automate scripts and have them running in the background. So definitely, it'll definitely be a good idea to kind of enumerate these things, especially if um, things are running as root, and trying to figure out ways where you can um, kind of have that, um, I guess, um, so like if you find that something is running as root and you have like, for example, write access over it, you can kind of modify, that specific script that's running in the background to kind of help you escalate your privileges. Like, for example, something easy you can do if you find like a script that's running as root and you have access to, um, you have like write access to it and you can write like a new line of code or whatever the case may be. Um, you can just go in and do something like this and have like bash have that SUID bit set. That's just like an example of something you can do to kind of gain or like abuse these if you find that you have permissions over that. Um, but yeah, that'll definitely help you escalate your privileges if you have those permissions. Kernel exploits. So here's a screenshot of kind of like linps. A lot of times linps will enumerate for possible kernel exploits that the current kernel version is vulnerable to. And then Dirty Cow is an example of one of the CVEs for a kernel exploit. Moving on to path injection. So path is basically a list of directories separated by colons. And this is kind of like how the Linux system um, looks for the system command binaries and like kind of like the search order for that. Um, and you can kind of trick the programs that don't use absolute paths. So for example, yeah, like this. So here, the absolute path for the base64 binary is user bin base64, and then base64 would be a relative path. And then you can inject a malicious binary to be executed first. So um, you can put it at the beginning of the path environment variable. Here's an example of it. So if we run strings on this program that's called vulnerable, we can see that it's using ping with a relative path and not the absolute path. So if we create a malicious binary named ping, and this is kind of just what it's doing with bin bash, and then it sets the ID, and then we set the path, and then with this period here or with this dot here, we're basically setting our current directory at the beginning of the path. So so when we run something that is using ping, like in this case, we'll run the vulnerable binary. Since we did this, and now that our current directory is at the beginning of the path search order, um, and this binary uses ping, this one gets executed first. So the malicious ping binary that we made in our current directory gets executed first. And as we can see, we have that being executed we have bin bash c ID, and then here we have the ID output. Well, then that was a quick session. But yeah, moving on to the lab. This will be the homework for the week. Um, we'll have the environment. The router will be out of scope. We have three Linux boxes, and here are the IPs. And basically, the goal is to find as many vulnerabilities as you can and kind of do a write-up on it. Um, I'll link, I'll link a a GitHub repo with like past CPTC reports to kind of give you guys like a template for something to reference. Um, I would say try to do kind of like a finding block that they have there. I don't think you have to go as far as writing like full executive summaries that are on some of those, but I would say probably try to do like some of the finding blocks and kind of use that to kind of explain your thought process behind some of the things that you did um, and like why you did it. Kind of just look through the repo. I'll send it. I could send it in the Zoom here actually. Yeah, I think CPTC is the most recent one that they have on here, but like here, I'll show you exactly like what I'm talking about. I really try to focus on making like finding blocks like these. I think these will be helpful to kind of keep your work organized and kind of cover a lot of things that are covered in competition. So, I mean, you can really pick any of these reports that you kind of like better. But like this is, one example, and include screenshots as well. Um, so yeah, explain like the impact of the vulnerabilities to technical audiences, and then there's a non-technical, like a business impact kind of thing in those finding blocks you'll see as well. Um, include your steps that you took to enumerate an exploit, and yeah, include as many screenshots as possible, and then try to provide like some remediations for that vulnerability that you found. And yeah, are there any questions?
I have a quick question. I've been absent the last couple weeks just because I've been busy. Is it still, can I still do the tryout and um, try it for CPTC?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I'd probably say if you missed last week, we have the recordings of those Zooms kind of posted on the website. So if you want to go look over those to kind of just double check you didn't, miss anything that you may not have known already. But yeah, tryouts is still possible for you.
Okay, thanks.
Aiden had a question. So three finding blocks would be enough to cover this assignment. Um, kind of not necessarily, I would say kind of try to build a finding block um for each vulnerability that you kind of find. Um, so like say you found that like FTP had was vulnerable to um to the CV for 2.3.4, then kind of go through um that the like this process of like writing that finding block for that specific vulnerability, and then kind of do that for all the vulnerabilities that you end up finding. Um, yeah, I would say try to find as many vulnerabilities as you can and write up a finding block for that. Not just kind of like a finding block for each box that's on the environment. Um, if no one else has any other questions, I guess that concludes today's session for week 4. Next session, I believe, is hacking Windows, and then it's followed by consulting, kind of like the business side of pen testing, and then after that will be tryouts. Um, but yeah, if you have any questions that you can't think of right now, but end up crossing your mind later on, don't hesitate to reach out to really any of the CPTC members. Oh, did I not send it? Oops. I'll send it in the CPP public Discord as well. Um, but yeah, if you have any questions later on, yeah, just don't hesitate to kind of reach out to any of us. Or if you end up needing help on the homework, also don't hesitate to um, reach out to one of us. I'll put out an announcement when the homework is available. If it takes longer than usual, like the web homework, we'll likely give an extension for that. But yeah, hopefully all goes well with that. But yeah, that concludes our session today. Thank you guys so much for joining. Um, Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out.